Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to this Provost seminar on teaching, which we've titled, What's Next? And that welcome goes for those who are here in the ballroom, as well as those joining us via Zoom for this plenary session. My name is Matt Kaplan. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Research on Learning and Teaching. CRLT has been organizing these Provost seminars for 25 years, twice a year, on a teaching and learning topic of interest to university leadership and the broader campus community. But this iteration is unique for a couple of reasons. First, it is the first Provost seminar we've offered since May 2019. In fact, our keynote speaker for the winter 2020 seminar was about to board a plane when we learned that the university was shutting down due to COVID on the day of the 2020 seminar. As a result of this gap, many of you have never attended a Provost seminar in teaching, and we're especially pleased to greet you as you join these conversations. The second way this seminar is unique is that it's a celebration of CRLT's 60th anniversary. Founded in 1962, ours was the first teaching center in the country, and we are proud of the role U of M played in founding a field that has grown to well over 1,000 teaching centers in the US and across the world. So we're thrilled to have all of you here with us today to celebrate. And while we don't have one big birthday cake, we do have celebratory cupcakes for lunch. Given this particular moment in time, we have chosen to focus this seminar on looking forward to the future of teaching learning rather than back to our own history. The word disruption is probably overused at this point, but there are few other terms that capture the impact of the past 3 years on higher education. This includes, of course, the rapid shift to emergency remote instruction in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the renewed reckoning with racial inequity and structural racism sparked by the murder of George Floyd. This seminar is titled, What's Next? And we hope that it will provoke lively discussions around a range of questions, such as, what have we learned from the past 3 years about approaches to teaching and grading, about promoting student wellness, about approaches to equity-focused teaching? How do we build on those lessons so that we do not revert to the status quo ante of February 2019? How do these conversations apply across schools, colleges, and disciplines? Today's program is an exciting opportunity to engage with this topic. And for many of you, I imagine this will be an extension of discussions that you've already been involved in. And we hope that the ideas and insights that come from this event contribute to ongoing conversations and seed new ones across the university, since this topic will no doubt occupy us for several years to come. Before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to recognize the outstanding team that developed and organized today's seminar. Dr. Melinda Matney, CRLT's Managing Director of Educational Development and Assessment Services, is right there. With Vice Provost James Hilton, as well as our faculty and CRLT staff presenters on the overall program. Liesl Topi, who is there by the door. Liesl is an events coordinator at CRLT who is responsible for the logistics of the day. And then members of the advisory committee are listed on the electronic agenda that you can access via QR code, and they gave us valuable input on the shape of the day. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists who will jumpstart today's conversation about what's next. Anne Curzan is Dean of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. Alec Gallimore is Dean of the College of Engineering. Elizabeth Moje is Dean of the School of Education. And Mike Solomon is Dean of Rackham Graduate School. And Tom Finholt, Vice Provost for Academic and Budgetary Affairs, and former Dean of the School of Information, will moderate the discussion. Each of these panelists has given great thought to what's next, both from their leadership and their faculty perspectives. So please join me in welcoming them.
Okay, good morning. I'm Tom Finholt. I'm happy to be with you this morning, see you all in person. It's very delightful, and thank you to my fellow panelists. So I'm going to start you off with a question that will give you a chance to talk about new things that you're doing. There have been numerous challenges over the last 3 years arising both from the pandemic and racial reckoning. What opportunities have risen from your school's response to these challenges? And Alec, I'll pitch it to you first.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone, and it's great to join my colleagues here on the panel. And we saw the uneven and inequitable suffering on this planet, and we said this is an opportunity for us to rethink what engineering is with a focus on equity. We also saw the demonstration of higher ed, and the University of Michigan is no exception to this, to be able to pivot very quickly. Things like, of course, going to fully remote, but also using the expertise we have on our campus, if you will, to affect positively how we're doing things, not only in the remote work world, but even things of changing the bus routes and how we do the buses, recycling N95 masks, and things of that nature. So it gave us an opportunity to think differently how we approach our work in academia. And then, of course, what was alluded to before, of course, was the murder of George Floyd also gave us an opportunity through that tragic event and other tragic events to really think about what is our role in higher ed. So hopefully you've all heard by now that we've had a focus that we started before certainly the pandemic, but the pandemic and the racial injustice that came to the fore of society just reinforced the notion of people-first engineering. And one element of that I'm really happy to talk about is our Teaching Engineering Equity Center that we received from the National Science Foundation. I'm happy about that because, first of all, what it does is it reinforces our notion that engineering is about people. In fact, all of higher ed is about people when you think about it, and engineering should not be an exception. And while technology plays a role in solving so many of our ills of societies, technology alone cannot solve it. So we wanted to make sure that we have practitioners as engineers who understand the nuances and the notion of equity as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the power of that in the role of engineering. So the elements of the T Center are, first of all, led by our Center for Socially Engaged Design. We're creating a library of case studies which has showed the historical misuse of technology to exacerbate differences between marginalized people and people in power as a cautionary tale about the importance of considering equity at the fore. Working with colleagues in the School of Education and LS&A, Professor Lisa Latuca, for example, is using evidence-based framework for teaching social aspects in engineering. And then finally, and I see her here, Dr. Toshia Pender-Grover of CRLT in engineering is building something that we can replicate, an infrastructure to teach cohorts of professors and faculty members on the notion of how to integrate modules associated with diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice into the engineering curriculum. Finally, as many of you may know, we launched this past academic year a new Department of Robotics, among the first in the nation. And the Department of Robotics, because we're using a clean slate approach, allows us to embed a lot of these elements of equity right at the get-go. So first of all, we're not starting with calculus, we're starting with linear algebra because calculus has been seen as something that has, if you will, continued the inequitable access of students to engineering, where talent is distributed uniformly more so than opportunity. And so, again, using this opportunity that we've had the last few years through the pandemic and also acknowledging that so many of us now use these online tools pretty equally allows us to accelerate the approach of creating modules, integrating these modules as we study engineering.
Great, thanks, Alec. We'll go to you, Elizabeth.
Great. Well, good morning, everyone. I think what really happened for us in the School of Education and actually across the university is that we saw a moment that required radical change, and we stepped into it. So like Alec, we and the College of Engineering, we rose to the occasion, and we did that all across campus. We saw the possibilities for change, and this actually helped us understand that we could continue to build on that change, that we could learn what we did well, what went well, and also think about what didn't go well, and think about the affordances of different media for learning. So that was exciting. We proved that we could do it differently. People in the School of Education who said we could never, ever teach online became convinced that it is actually possible and that you can actually build those connections and in some ways engage in more equitable work. And one reason we thought about that was we suddenly had to focus more on learning. What are people learning? Now, what's interesting about this is that now as we come back, right, supposedly come back, we're hearing a lot about people saying, but the kids are behind. Whether it's in preschool education, K-12 education, or higher education, we're hearing people talk about the kids being behind. I spent an all-day meeting on Thursday of last week engaged with education leaders from around the United States talking about K-12 and what we were going to do to ramp up and get them back on track. And I've also heard this at the university, so this is not just a K-12 issue. We hear that kids have come into classrooms and they don't know, quote, what they're supposed to know. They're not ready. And so we are really trying to push this notion of being ready and being behind and actually ask ourselves, who sets that standard? And how might this be a moment where we actually learn to meet students where they are, as opposed to labeling them as being up to speed or ready or behind? Now, this is really important because one of the things that we're finding is that our young people, and again, this is true pre-K through 12, as well as higher ed, have gone through 2.5 years of trauma. And it's really important to stop thinking about, but they're supposed to be here academically, and think about what they need to be able to learn and to thrive, to be able to maintain that sense of belonging, that sense of possibility, and then dig into the academic dimension of this. It's really, really important. In Detroit, where I do my work and where we have our school at Marygrove, we have teachers who were talking about kids being every week going to a funeral, right? Every week during the shutdown, going to a funeral. They're not ready to engage in academic learning in the same way that they might have been in the past. So we really need to work on that. So one of the things that I hope we can talk about is how we refocus and actually think about what the study of learning teaches us and pull that into how we think about our teaching. There's all sorts of research, all kinds of evidence from the learning sciences that tell us how people learn. They learn best when they have a purpose for learning, when there's a frame that helps them tie new concepts together. They learn best when their identities are recognized, when they're seen as having assets that they bring to the classroom. They learn best when they're engaged in doing things that require them to use the skills and the knowledge that we're trying to teach them. So much about what we do here in higher education is antithetical to just those 3 points that I made. And those are just some of the findings from the study of how people learn. So we really need to think about what would that mean for our teaching? Now, I know I'm kind of, preaching to the choir here. You all already think about your teaching and you think about learners. But how do we provide models for other people to think about teaching differently, scaffolding students' understanding? If they're, quote, behind, how do we make sure that we can help them learn and learn deeply? How do we change our instruction and our assessment? Paul and I were talking earlier about mastery assessments, actually evaluating for mastery. But that requires us to change the way we teach, not just to change the way we grade. So I'm going to stop there because I want to take all the time from Mike and Ann.
Go ahead, Mike.
Great, thank you. Really delighted to have been invited on the panel, especially from the point of view of being able to kind of put graduate education within the same framing that we're having here in this conversation today. So from the perspective of Rackham, where we could look across the 120 PhD programs and this approximately same number of master's programs, I think one of the strengths we saw just was the response to the level of disruption. We found that we could extend academic deadlines in ways that had never been done before, that we could actually change how qualifying exams were implemented, that there were just really ways to a system that had been put together and really held relatively static for decades, actually at that moment, due to just the level of disruption, could be changed. Students, I think, that were struggling within that system were always there, and I think it was really, in many ways, largely unrecognized. It took the magnitude of the disruption, the number of students that were having challenges, and it wasn't just about the change in modality of the work, it was also whether even you could do the work or what the work would specifically look like. That level of disruption, I think, really was a shock to graduate education, and systems, the departments really responded in really creative and responsive ways that I think were a strength. And so I guess you talked about radical change. I guess I would put on the table that what impressed me, or what I think a strength of our university was the ability to make department level, I would call it systems change, like change in how we thought about the structure of our degrees in ways that were very supportive to students. Some of the same things that you mentioned, I think if we were just to use the specific example in graduate education of what a qualifying exam looks like, or in your space it might be a preliminary examination or a prospectus examination, you know, could that exam be thought of as being developmental as opposed to being evaluative? Could what that exam entails, as opposed to being hidden, be brought to life? Could a class be run at the same time that would describe to students what they're actually being evaluated on? And would that be a productive way to think about how we're trying to move, what we're actually really trying to accomplish in graduate education? The graduate school was just tremendously impressed how schools, departments saw that that was what the moment required. And I think the challenge now is, can we carry that forward? Some of this change was there before the pandemic, but I think it just really brought it to surface in a way that I think is really positive, and something that, as an institution, I would love to see us carry forward.
Go ahead, Ann.
So thanks, and I'm delighted to see all of you here in person to talk about teaching. And it's really interesting to go last, because I think when you think about the title of this panel, you could think we would all be here talking about online education and what will be next in terms of how much online teaching we will be doing. And I think we do need to talk about that. But I love where we're all focusing, which is what were the opportunities that this, call it a disruption, bringing to surface things that had long been there, and asking us to deal with them. And so I'm going to pick up a couple of themes around the opportunities here. I think for many of us and many of you in the room, one of the challenges of the last 2.5 or 3 years has been doing crisis management, daily, urgent crisis management, while trying to hold on to bigger picture, visionary things that you could see were happening and needed to happen at the same time, and grab those opportunities that were there. And I will say, for me, one of the exciting things was that we saw some very traditional practices at the university and in the academy more broadly disrupted or upended. And I see Mark Moldwin is here. He and I had spent over a year on a task force rethinking education for the third century, undergraduate education. And we wanted to think about things like grading. And people said, you can't touch that. You can't touch that. Well, we touched that, right? I mean, you think about the pandemic, and a month in, we're like, okay, we're just gonna have to totally rethink grading. And the great thing was that students still learned, the world did not end. We saw that we could actually rethink grading. Some other practices like high stakes evening exams that are proctored, which has been a part of many of our educational practices throughout the university, suddenly we couldn't do that. So we had to think about, okay, what happens when we have to evaluate or assess learning in a different way? And I love that Elizabeth has put on the table that we need to think about learning. We've always needed to think about learning. Teaching is about learning. That's what it's about. And so to be able to rethink everything from grading to how we assess learning to things like, I will say we had many schools and colleges that would say we won't accept transfer credits for online courses. And suddenly that didn't seem like such a good practice anymore because we were like, oh, right, online courses, we teach those too. So as we think about equity and access, it has asked us to rethink practices that we knew, many of us I think knew we needed to rethink, but it felt too hard or we couldn't get the momentum. And one of the things I think we will talk about is how do we hold on to that momentum? It is one of the real concerns that many of us had in 2020 and in 2021, people saying this is urgent, whether that's around racial justice, whether that's around how do we teach, and it is our responsibility to make sure that we hold on to that and we actually do some of this change that is sitting there for us. How do we want to help students when they're not here? How do we do spring summer teaching? How do we help students when they're having internships or study abroad? And then I do want to put on the table for us to talk about student wellness. So Tom, you brought that up. That, again, this has been something that has been concerning to many of us for years. As Alec mentioned, this was devastating, and the impacts were not the same. We know this in terms of who experienced the pandemic in more traumatic ways, whose families did, whose communities did, the racial reckoning of 2020 and beyond. And so I think I'm really pleased that the university as a whole is thinking about wellness in a holistic way. And one thing I'll put on the table, what we're trying to do in LSA is we're actually about to hire 2 student mental health and wellness advocates. There's often a focus on counselors, which we definitely need more counselors, but we actually have to rethink structures. We have to rethink structures for how do we help students be able to learn and thrive, and that is stepping back and thinking about more preventive measures as opposed to only counseling. So much to talk about. Tom, let me turn it back over to you.
Great. Well, you can see a theme emerging here that we all believe that there was a status quo. The events of the last 3 years dramatically disrupted that status quo, and as Elizabeth particularly alluded to, there's a potential for inflection here. And we know from organizational theory that there's this concept of threat rigidity, that at the moment of greatest crisis, when you need to have maximum flexibility and openness, is exactly when it is the most difficult to be open to the kinds of changes and exploration you need to do to move forward. And when we were preparing for this panel, we had kind of a refrain, which was 2019, not 1919. And I think you coined that actually, so it wasn't really a collective effort, but now we're going to collectively claim it. So thank you, Elizabeth, for that one. So what I put to the panel now is, and this is picking up your last point, Anne, is how do we maintain this momentum forward around this moment of inflection, given the exhaustion that people are experiencing and the new challenges that have surfaced and the new claims on our attention and resources and so forth. So I'll pitch it to you first, Elizabeth.
Okay, I wasn't prepared for that. I thought we were going in order. See, rigidity.
I know,
It's
you just
just
gotta,
so
you gotta
easy
go
to,
with the flow, right?
So easy to fall right back into that. Well, you know, actually the 2019, not 1919, as I reflected on that, I thought, well, actually 2019 was a lot like 1919. Our teaching hadn't actually changed that much in those 100 years, or maybe the 100 before. So our real goal is to push ourselves to think out of the box and think about the kinds of resources that people need to reorient their teaching and think about how they might respond to those concepts about how people learn. Where would we start with that? And so one of the things that Paul Resnick wave your hand, because this, and I were talking about was this question of mastery, and I think Anne mentioned mastery. We've all kind of hinted at mastery. And thinking about what does it mean to engage in mastery assessment, and how do we need to think about, that's not just taking away grades, right? We took away grades for a little bit, or we did them differently. We still gave grades, we just did it differently. So what does it mean if you're really evaluating for mastery? And how do you think about how people come to the teaching moment? Or really the learning moment? How do they come into the space? They don't all come in with the same skills, the same knowledges, the same dispositions, and certainly, as the panelists said, they don't come in with all of the same resources. So if we're really serious about mastery, we have to start there with how do our students come to us, and not talk about how we want them to come to us, but how they really are. And then think about the kinds of resources, I'm looking at the Vice Provost for budget, that we need to ensure that we can build those different kinds of resources different kinds of systems, really systems that are going to help our students best learn. And I'm really taken with this idea of an advocate for health and wellness. I love that idea, as opposed to waiting until, to a reactive point. So thinking about how we might all start staffing our schools with people who can advocate for those kinds of supports, who can teach our students that it's okay to say they're struggling, or to ask for help, to go to office hours, right? That's just a starting place. Then we need to do a lot more, I think, in-depth training of ourselves, of our faculties who need to learn how to teach and not simply tell and then test. And I think I could say a lot more about the kinds of resources that we might need, but I'll give a shout out to CRLT and say maybe CRLT needs to double in size so that they can reach every member of our faculty. I'll stop there. Gets it. Oh, yeah.
So if I can just jump in there for a moment, because I think it's such an important question for all of us right now. And Tom, you said, there's the exhaustion. How do we do this? And I mean, I appreciate that all of you are here. And I think one of the questions is, how can we get people excited about this work? And for people to be excited, it has to feel possible. That you're not going to just have these conversations and then once again, write a report and it's going to go in a drawer and nothing changes. So how do we, and part of this is we're going to have to talk about ideologies, like the ideology of rigor, right? So we have to talk about that, because we have very old-fashioned notions of what is rigorous. And Elizabeth, you just had sort of tell and test and see if you can figure out what's going to be on that test. And what we know, and this is something we've been doing in LSA with some of our big classes, which are often known as weeder classes. Now, you should not have classes that are known as weeder classes. I just think if you care about equity and access, and you have classes that do that, you have a problem. And we have the reports now to show that these courses, they don't just weed, they weed disproportionately. They weed out first-generation students. They often weed out underrepresented students. They weed out women. So we know that. So then we say, the rigorous part is, how do you actually change your teaching to be able to do better? And that takes a huge amount of thought and work to be willing and to do that, to have the research to be able to do that. And it's really interesting to me, over the pandemic, I remember talking with a student who's in one of our big intro science classes that had often had these evening exams, and instead had a take-home open book exam. And I said, which one was harder? And he said, oh, for sure, the take-home open book. For sure. He said, I actually had to learn the material as opposed to memorize it. And and I think it's true, but at the same time, and this picks up Elizabeth's point, it is harder and more time consuming to create that exam, to grade that exam. So in order to make this possible, we do have to think about resources. If we're really gonna say, rethink this, there is something, you get it. It is very efficient to do one-time exams at night, proctored, get it done, right? When we're teaching classes with hundreds and hundreds of students, and that's what some of our classes are. So if we're really gonna ask people to do that, then we have to back it up in order to make that actually possible.
So that's a good segue to you, Mike, actually, because Elizabeth raised the possibility of reallocating resources, and one of those reallocations is already occurring. The provost has created a student success initiative, and actually Mike is the person in charge of that, and it alludes a little bit to some of the data that our colleagues in LSA have collected on the student experience. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that, because I think that's an example of one of these points of inflection that we're grabbing onto and trying to push forward on. So go ahead.
Great, Tom. You made Elizabeth nervous earlier. You just made me nervous there. Our Vice Provost for Budget Affairs talked about reallocation. It's great that you're keeping us on our toes. So I'm really delighted to talk about some work that is really, I think invitations are going out today to a few members to participate just in this kind of broader discussion around academic success, what that looks like, how one generates momentum towards academic success as one arrives in the university, and how differential that is. When you think about momentum, like what is that? Well, that is actually something that you acquire when you come to the university that puts you on this path that you're taking a regular load of credits, that you're succeeding in your classes in ways that are ultimately going to lead to you as a student realizing your goals for the degree, which include graduation. So when we look at our 4- and 6-year graduation rates at the University of Michigan, we have much to be proud of. And at the same time, when you think about this in an individualized way, it's clear that there are students in their first year that struggle to generate that early momentum. And that then becomes a question that both requires innovation at this kind of systems or institutional or school college way in which we've been describing, but also the willingness to think about students individually, to perhaps use data that we have at an institutional level to understand how different students acquire early momentum. And if they haven't acquired it, what could we do in an interventionist way, kind of in the real time of the academic term to support them further? So this is a place in which we think experimentation, pilot level activities within the school and college are going to be kind of welcomed and necessary for us to walk into this way, that we can really have this system in which students acquire the momentum that then propels them on in their academic journey. Thanks, Tom.
Alec, in the College of Engineering, I recently learned about the SPIRE activity, which is your efforts along with your colleagues to help students identify their co-curricular engagements that will promote their career possibilities. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. This was in partnership with the Office of Academic Innovation. We developed this online tool, if you will, sort of a partner with the students, because what we did is we developed 12 experiential learning areas of focus that we want based on interviewing our alums and saying what is it that they found beyond the technical education of the College of Engineering that best gave them the tools they needed for success, so these competencies. And what SPIRE does, SPIRE attempts to ask our students questions about what they're interested in going into, what sort of their life ambitions are, if you will, which of course is tricky with 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, and 58-year-olds also, by the way, sometimes. But, you know, at that time stamp, what we do is we use this tool to map in, based on what the students tell us, some competencies that they need to hone. And then also what SPIRE does is allows the students to identify opportunities, experiential learning opportunities for them to partake. So these could be competition teams, these could be groups of students organized for various outreach activities, et cetera. Because our goal, even though we have about 8,000 undergraduates in the College of Engineering, our goal is truthfully to try to make every experience that the student has bespoke, customized to the student's needs. And the way, as Ann mentioned, on the mental wellness aspect, you can't counsel your way out of it. It has to be a myriad type of resources. And one we've embraced is this notion of online support and AI, frankly, to help support the students achieve the best outcome possible.
I mean, it strikes me that that engagement across a portfolio of co-curricular activities is also probably integral to mental health, because those are different kinds of social groups that you're interacting with. You're out there, people are responding to you. You have purpose and motivation besides what you get.
Well, that's funny you say that. Our experiential learning office, which is called the Immerse office, the hashtag is practice your purpose, which we're very proud of.
Great. So I'm looking at Matthew now, and what is our time limit here? Okay. So do you want us to create opportunity for people to ask questions, or? Yeah, I think we'd be okay with that, right? Unless anyone had a final word that they wanted to offer. Right.
I might just, and then I'd love to hear questions, what's on people's minds. Alec, as you were just talking about AI and online ways that we can support individual students, and I do think this is going to be a really important tool for us, and in LSA it's eCoach, where you're trying to, even in big classes, help individual students as they hit particular challenges or hurdles.
Spire is actually built on top of eCoach.
So how do you do that? It also has me thinking, though, about, what are we, as we think about student success, one of the things that we know correlates with student success is having a mentor, an actual human mentor. And that's the balance I think I'm thinking about for us, which is how do we use the online tools and the AI tools, remote teaching when it's the right thing, when it does enhance learning, and what we know about what's so important about residential education and getting mentors and those relationships, because those relationships are critical for students to thrive here, to stay here, and to succeed after they leave here. And so that balance, I think, is a really important part of where should we be going, is making sure we don't lose sight of that.
We all get in last words. Go, is that one? Okay. I wanted to just really just touch on this, the well-being aspect that we've talked about, and just say an observation that we've seen in Rackham that is really convergent. We've had kind of two lead programs to work with departments around changing their curriculum. One we call Advancing New Directions, which is really how should curriculum change to really meet the next century of needs for graduate education. And then we have another program that is our advocate program that is around how do you support well-being of graduate students within graduate programs. Both of these activities we've noticed, when the faculty that we are working with in their programs, when they sit down to what they do, they actually are doing this recognizing that milestone exams really are learning opportunities. They're not evaluative opportunities. And once you think in that way, well, then you're thinking about, if you think of them as learning opportunities, prepare for them that way, you address the well-being of graduate students and you move graduate education into the next century. So there's no trade-off here, in my view. Like the excellence that we need and the support of well-being are convergent, and they're both on the same path. And I think we're seeing that in graduate education, and I would imagine as well in other areas.
So I think you're going to see a theme here. I really want to underscore, too, the mental health, the socio-emotional health of our students. And I see Rajesh Mangrikar right here, and he and I have been talking a lot about not only the social determinants of health, but the health determinants of learning. Our students can't learn if they are not healthy. So that's number one. But then I want to underscore that we also shouldn't just focus on fixing our students. And Mike set this up nicely. When we change instructional arrangements, when we do things differently, we're actually creating opportunities for socio-emotional, for healthy socio-emotional development. So if we change the way we think about teaching and we don't have weeder courses, we have courses where we believe all students can learn, then we've already started to improve the mental health and well-being of our students. And then the last thing I want to say, Alec mentioned, really trying to ensure that everybody has something that they're engaged in co-curricularly. But I would push us to ask ourselves, why co-curricular? Why not actually give credits for those co-curricular things? And I think you do that in the College of Engineering. I think a lot of places do that, but we could do a lot more of it because our students are trying desperately to build portfolios that are going to make them look successful so they can be out in the world, and they do everything. They're just overachievers. They're trying to be in everything. Let's give them credit for that. And think about our 120 credits or whatever the HLC, I know I'm supposed to know that, we just went through review. But let's think differently about how that works and how we award credit for those things.
Yeah, go ahead, Alec.
So I'm trying to put myself in your shoes and say, what takeaway could you have for this panel? And there's a few things. Maybe one, I think I'm heartened to see leaders here, deans here, who really care about, as you said, not only teaching but learning. So I think that's a really great start as a takeaway, that this is something that we take seriously. But also, how do you go from this notion of what you're learning here in the session and put it to practice? And I was trying to think of a framework. And I guess what comes to my mind is the more we can communicate the importance of this and why it's critical to the mission and the roles that we have, be it in medicine or the humanities and social sciences and engineering, I think the better. And having discussions with your colleagues. I also believe there's a way of holding leaders accountable, frankly, for this. Department chairs, associate deans, and even deans saying, this is critical to the mission. Why is it that we have education and Rackham and engineering LS&A? Why isn't our unit engaged to this degree? I think it's very important to do those type of things. I think piloting and experimentation is also very important as well, and thinking about what kind of resources are needed to do those type of things, and also how do you incentivize faculty members in particular to try experimentations? How do you create, if you will, communities for people to discuss these type of things, if you will, in a safe environment is important. These are the things that come to my mind, and I think all of our units have been trying these things with varying degrees of success. I'd say a fair amount of success, as a matter of fact. But I think there are things we could do to replicate this more across the university.
Questions?
And while he's moving over for a question, I'm going to start with a question from our Zoom participants today. We have a few of them. What do you see as some of the biggest systemic barriers or resistances to dismantling the status quo and moving toward learner-centered education? What might we learn by looking at models other than other high-ranking R1 institutions or PWIs? An easy one to start with.
It's the question, right? As I said before, part of it is ideological. It's on us that so much of, and I'm in here with everybody else, so much of how we teach is based on how we were taught, which was based on how they were taught. That when you step back and actually look at the research about learning, and then look at our teaching practices, there's so much to rethink. It's hard work. The resource question is big here. And then how do we show that we value that? We've got to align our reward systems with the work. And I can imagine lecturers who haven't gone through a major review saying, I don't know that I want to be the one piloting something that might not work, or assistant professors without tenure saying, really? You want me to be the one in here? It's going to take a lot of work, and it might not work. And so leave it, we have to create the room for experimentation, some of which will work, some of which won't. We have to align our reward systems, and we have to talk about the ideologies that are getting in the way. We have to be accountable for those, including, I'll just put it on the table again, this idea of rigor. Because I can imagine people who are listening to us and saying, that doesn't sound rigorous to me. That sounds like hand-holding. As opposed to, that sounds like support for individual students to be able to learn and thrive, they are at the University of Michigan because we know that they can succeed here. And so then it is our responsibility to make sure that they succeed here, which is a very different way of thinking about rigor and learning.
Am I on? Oh, sorry. Thank you, guys. I just have to say, I'm Raj Mangrulkar from the Michigan Center for Interprofessional Education. I just want to say, first, we're very fortunate to have the four of you leading very important schools here because you're rethinking assumptions that have been long held here. I wonder if we could just turn back to well-being. Much of the literature shows that well-being plummets during transitions. And I wonder if you guys can talk a little bit about how we should be transitioning, onboarding students who enter our community in a much more systematic way than we do right now. Many of the weed out classes happen in that first semester. Many of our students, as a parent of 3 kids who have gone through U of M, come from high schools where this is the mindset, tell and teach. How do we change their mindsets and support them better in that first semester or maybe even that first year?
I'm happy to. That's a great point, and I feel when I used a word like early momentum, I think you're diving in and starting to explain exactly how one acquires that. So I really like to hear confirm, like we're kind of making a little bit of an assumption that when we think about the overall success of a student, that we should really kind of start from day one. We should really be looking in the first term. And there's not as much data to support that as you might actually think. There's some that is emerging. And so I think then the question is, how do you then support that? And so this kind of, I heard individualized, I heard advising, I heard day one. I think those are things that are all on the table, and I would connect this to Alex's point about pilot and exploratory activities. I think how this looks can vary across our schools and colleges, but that we all should really start moving in that direction. Thanks.
I'll just jump in. Actually, interestingly, you're exactly right about transitions, and that's across the P20 spectrum, that every transition point, when you look at data, you'll see kids who are successful and then they plummet wherever they transitioned. It doesn't matter whether it's 5th grade to 6th grade, 8th grade to 9th grade, there's a plummet in, its achievement. It's measured on some sort of test. So that's a really, really important point. And it might not surprise those of you who know me and the work that we're doing in Detroit to hear that I think we should be breaking that fourth wall more consistently and actually engaging with high schools, engaging with middle schools, engaging with elementary, with babies, so that we're actually building this P20 system, right? So that we're not thinking you move from one and it's sink or swim. But I also think we need to think about that for our faculty. I don't think we're necessarily great at mentoring and supporting new faculty members either. And so that transition needs to be something that we consider as well.
So just one other thought. I really appreciate the point, Rajesh, and I think one is to normalize. We know that these transition points are stressful, they cause anxiety, they can cause changes in performance. First of all, we need to talk about that. Because I think many of our students think they are the only one who's experiencing this, and our faculty and everybody else. I'm the only one who's experiencing this. I shouldn't be stressed. This shouldn't be hard. So part of it is to normalize. Stress and anxiety are part of life. There are worrying levels of stress and anxiety that we also absolutely have to deal with. But to talk about that and to provide the support systems. And I will just put on the table, the task force that you were on and Mark was on and I was on, I'm sure there are a couple other people in the room I haven't seen, we were thinking about grading in that first year of what would happen if you did the equivalent of hiding grades so students could see how things were going but not be penalized for it. Because we know that in that first year, some students really, really struggle, and then they spend the next 3 or 4 years trying to recover from a first year that we could have predicted was going to be hard. And so why are we doing that? And I think, does any employer or graduate school really need 4 years worth of grades? The answer is No. So there are big things. You can see I'm now willing to talk about it. People are like, you can't talk about grades. I'm going to talk about grades.
Thank you for Thank you for opening the conversation on grades and well-being. I want to offer a perhaps controversial position that I think grade compression is one of the contributors to student anxiety. That you can't, grade compression, when 60% of the students are getting the same top grade, that means if you have one bad semester, you can't recover. You can never demonstrate that you're one of the top students because there is no way to demonstrate other than to be perfect all the time. And I have to say grading is one of the most disagreeable things that we do. We hate it. I hated grading students. I hated evaluating faculty for tenure. Everywhere in our profession that we do evaluation is distasteful. But I think if we refuse to do it, we're going to do a disservice to the students.
But could we do it differently, Paul? And I think that's the key question. You know, if we are evaluating, if we are assessing, what if we took the word evaluation out and thought about assessing growth and thinking about growth over time as opposed to you're either here or you're not. You're off the bus if you don't get, you don't achieve this. Because I think you're absolutely right. I think it's really increases stress.
Well, I'll briefly follow on. At our College of Engineering Leadership retreat, we looked at the kind of data you're talking about. And if you go back about 3 years ago or so, the median GPA for students after their first semester in the College of Engineering was about a 3.5, 3.6. The last 2 years, last year or so was a 3.7 was the median. And so we looked at that and we're trying to understand what does that mean. Now part of it might be, we know there was some changes in what kind of grades were given during the pandemic and things of that nature, but it's a great question that we're trying to understand exactly what does this mean and what role do we have as academic leaders as well, but also what impact are we having on our learners when essentially, as you say, if you have one bad day, you're convinced that your entire first year or maybe your entire 4 years as an undergraduate is ruined. And we talked about mental wellness. Of course they're coupled together. Of course they are.
What I love, Elizabeth, about what you said, I mean, is disentangling feedback from grades, right? I mean, that's, and often we don't, this is where we need to be more careful about the conversations and more rigorous about the conversations we're having, which is assessment becomes, what was the grade? But actually, if we're assessing learning and we're giving feedback to push students toward excellence, as well as faculty, I mean, how we think about this, I think that to me is exciting to think about that piece.
Well, I would like to give a big thank you to this panel for their comments today. And I want to second something that Raj said, that we are very lucky to have leaders like you here at the university that are engaging in these conversations. So thank you all very much again for that. Right now we have some time for table conversations. We've got about 15 minutes for you to talk at your tables, and there's also going to be conversation for the folks who are in the Zoom session. And thinking about what resonated for you, what's challenging here, do you have ideas about how to spread the word? Here, I think that idea of spreading the excitement around this and getting people engaged in the conversation is really important. And then we know that there are disciplinary differences and differences in the types of kinds of classes that people teach. So take 15 minutes. We'll have a chance to talk about this, and then my colleague Melinda will tell you about the rest of the day.